Unlike most countries, in South Korea, the identities of criminals are usually kept private from the general public. However, when someone commits an atrocity like the one committed by the man you're about to hear about, public pressure can force the government to reveal the details of the tragedy. Thanks to that, we now know the story of a depraved individual who, before hiding behind a mask in front of the media, hid behind a computer screen. More specifically, he spent his time playing League of Legends, an online video game where he unfortunately met his future victim, a victim whose only mistake was enough for her stalker to eventually show up at her front door with sinister intentions. On March 29, 2021, a large portion of South Korea's population took to the streets demanding justice for the crimes committed by a stalker whose identity authorities initially refused to reveal. Rumors about the horrific crime he had allegedly committed spread so rapidly that more than 120,000 signatures were collected, demanding that the government finally disclose who he was and what he had done. As a result, authorities eventually revealed the name of Kim Tae-hyun, a young man known for his erratic behavior. But to understand how he ended up making headlines across the country, we need to go back to the beginning of his story. Kim Tae-hyun was born in November 1996 in the city of Busan, South Korea. However, he would not spend much of his childhood there. Along with his parents and younger brother, he later moved to the Gangnam district, one of the busiest and most well-known areas of Seoul. It was there that he grew up and attended school all the way through high school. However, as many people know, South Korea is an extremely competitive country when it comes to academics. Students are expected to devote themselves day and night to their studies in order to stand out and make their families proud. But under that pressure, Tae-hyun struggled to keep up and ultimately failed to make it into university. His situation became even worse in 2015 when his parents divorced. With both his professional future and his family life looking far bleaker than he had imagined as a child, Tae-hyun fell into a deep depression. He began isolating himself in a basement apartment, rarely seeing daylight. During this period, he poured all of his energy into the popular video game League of Legends. After spending countless hours playing, he became fairly skilled at it. At first, League of Legends was simply a hobby, but over time it became his entire life. He spent day and night glued to his chair, playing game after game without stopping. Just imagine what that basement must have looked and smelled like. But Tae-hyun was happy living that way. Through online communities centered around the game, he started making friends and devoted himself completely to playing, finally finding the sense of accomplishment that comes from being recognized as good at something. Eventually, his only goal in life became climbing the game's competitive rankings. He dreamed of becoming known in the esports scene, competing internationally, and joining one of the multi-million-dollar organizations that dominate professional gaming. And in South Korea, becoming a well-known League of Legends player can bring celebrity status. Some players are even treated as national heroes. However, Tae-hyun's dreams of becoming a professional gamer would have to be put on hold. In 2016, he was called to complete South Korea's mandatory military service, a requirement that most South Korean men must fulfill for roughly 2 years. Here's an interesting fact. Artists and athletes who achieve exceptional international accomplishments and bring significant attention to South Korea are among the few people who can receive exemptions from military service. For example, the legendary League of Legends player Faker was exempted after achieving extraordinary success on the world stage. But Tae-hyun was nowhere near that level. So unlike Faker, he spent the next 2 years serving his country. After completing his military service, Tae-hyun returned to his hometown and went back to working at a PC cafe, the same type of place where he had spent so much of his free time gaming. For him, it was the perfect job. He only wanted to earn enough money to survive so that he could dedicate the rest of his time to playing games. Working at a PC cafe allowed him to do exactly that. In fact, his addiction to gaming became so severe that he was fired from more than one cafe for spending work hours playing instead of doing his job. PC cafes in South Korea are very different from what many people in other parts of the world imagine. In some ways, they resemble casinos more than traditional internet cafes. Many visitors lose all sense of time while sitting behind a computer for hours on end without interruption. For Tae-hyun, it was the ideal environment. These places were filled with people who, like him, used video games as an escape from reality. And to be clear, this isn't meant as criticism of video games. Only a tiny percentage of players become so consumed by them that they abandon their real lives. An even smaller percentage go on to do what this man eventually did. Then, near Christmas of 2020, Tae-hyun began meeting other League of Legends players in person. They played together at PC cafes, went out to eat, and sometimes drank alcohol together. During one of these gatherings, he met a woman who was only a year older than him. Because she shared many of the same geeky interests, Tae-hyun quickly became fascinated with her. The more he learned about her, the stronger his feelings grew. To protect the privacy of the victim and prevent the media from harassing her family, authorities never publicly revealed her identity. Let's call this woman Gia. At first, Tae-hyun spent time with Gia and the rest of their gaming group like any normal friend. Most of their interactions revolved around gaming, and every now and then they would all hang out together to relax and have fun. But by mid-January 2021, Tae-hyun began trying to spend more time alone with Gia. The young woman quickly noticed his intentions and made it clear from the very beginning that she did not share his feelings. In fact, she felt uncomfortable around him. The way he approached her seemed strange, and his behavior often made her uneasy. Tae-hyun did not handle the rejection well. He convinced himself that if he simply tried harder and harder, eventually she would accept him, as if winning someone's affection were no different from climbing the ranked ladder in League of Legends. Eventually, he decided to be completely direct about his feelings. Gia responded with an equally direct rejection. That was when Tae-hyun lost control. He began yelling at her, and the situation quickly turned into an argument. The confrontation happened during one of the group's usual outings. After witnessing his erratic behavior firsthand, the other members of the group gradually stopped talking to him and avoided inviting him to future gatherings. Most people would have taken that as a sign to apologize and move on. But Tae-hyun wasn't willing to let his crush continue living her life as if nothing had happened. Demonstrating just how poor his social awareness had become, he didn't simply try speaking to Gia again. He relentlessly pressured her to go on a date with him. Each time, she rejected him. And from that point forward, his frustration over being rejected evolved into something far more disturbing. He became obsessed. Tae-hyun began stalking Gia through every avenue he could find. First, he attempted to contact her through the chat systems of various online games. When those messages went unanswered, he moved on to social media. He called her cell phone repeatedly, sometimes even using public telephones to hide his identity. Whenever possible, he left voicemail messages without identifying himself. As if that weren't enough, he also began researching the places she regularly visited, especially the PC cafes where she liked to spend time gaming. Faced with this escalating harassment, Gia had little choice but to block him everywhere. She changed her phone number. She stopped attending gaming meetups because she was afraid of running into him. She even removed Tae-hyun from her League of Legends friends list to prevent him from seeing when she was online. Yet none of it stopped him. If anything, every attempt to cut him off only fueled his obsession further. At this point, his life was no longer centered around climbing the ranks in League of Legends. His new obsession was finding some way, any way, to force contact with Gia again. Somehow, Tae-hyun managed to obtain her new phone number. The harassment immediately resumed. He sent endless text messages and voice messages. He called her from multiple numbers and created fake social media accounts solely to continue contacting her from different profiles. Around this same period, something unusual was happening at the PC cafe where Tae-hyun worked. Money had been disappearing from the cash registers. The owner eventually became suspicious and decided to review the security footage. What he discovered shocked him. The person responsible for the thefts was Tae-hyun. The owner fired him immediately and banned him from returning to the business. However, he chose not to press criminal charges. The two had been friends, and in South Korea, reputation carries enormous social weight. Publicly exposing what Tae-hyun had done could have completely destroyed his future. Even so, Tae-hyun had now reached one of the lowest points of his life. He had already been an isolated individual, but without his gaming friends and his job, he became even more withdrawn. The people who knew him began to suspect that something was seriously wrong. His sudden disappearance, combined with his increasingly strange behavior, caused rumors to spread throughout their social circle. People began describing him as a violent and obsessive stalker. What's particularly disturbing is that Kim Tae-hyun already had a history of harassment complaints. Back in 2019, another person had reported him for stalking and harassing them through social media. The victim's identity has never been revealed, but the situation became serious enough that law enforcement eventually had to get involved. And because of that, Tae-hyun received only a relatively small fine, roughly equivalent to a few dozen US dollars. That same year, he was reportedly caught entering a women's public restroom for sexual purposes, resulting in another fine of approximately 2 million Korean won, or around $1,700. His third known penalty came after he sent voice recordings to a girl attending a local school. In the recordings, he could allegedly be heard making strange noises and saying unsettling things. These repeated incidents may have contributed to his financial troubles. With a growing record of misconduct, finding stable employment became increasingly difficult, and his skills in League of Legends certainly weren't enough to pay the mounting fines. But none of that seemed to matter much to him. By this point, his obsession with Gia had become the central focus of his life. And if he couldn't have her, he began convincing himself that no one else should either. Unfortunately for Gia, like many young people, she occasionally shared glimpses of her life on Instagram. One day, excited about an online purchase that had finally arrived, she uploaded a photo to show her followers. There was just one problem. Without realizing it, some personal information printed on the package was visible in the background of the image. Among that information was her home address. And somehow Tae-hyun saw the post. He immediately wrote down the address and began putting together a plan that had been forming in his mind for months. To help carry it out, he created a new League of Legends account and concealed his identity. Using this anonymous profile, he sent Gia a friend request. Having no reason to suspect who was behind the account, she accepted. The two played together for hours at a time. And through those gaming sessions, Tae-hyun gained something he desperately wanted, a way to closely monitor her online activity. He began studying her routine. He learned when she went to work, when she usually slept, and the times she most often logged in to play games. Armed with both her address and knowledge of her schedule, he started visiting the area around her residence to verify the information for himself. He watched. He observed. And eventually, he convinced himself that he had gathered everything he needed. On the morning of May 21, 2021, Tae-hyun woke up unusually early. Investigators later discovered that he conducted a series of disturbing internet searches throughout the day. He looked up places where someone could hide in an emergency, methods of killing a person quickly, and the location of Mapo Bridge. That final search was particularly alarming because Mapo Bridge is widely known in South Korea for its association with suicides. Afterward, Tae-hyun packed a white backpack. Inside were spare clothes, gloves, tape, and several knives. He dressed entirely in black, put on a black mask to conceal part of his face, and traveled more than 16 kilometers toward his destination. At approximately 5:13 p.m., surveillance cameras captured him entering a PC cafe that Gia frequently visited. Footage showed him remaining inside for about 20 minutes. Curiously, he spent much of that time sitting, without even turning on a computer. He later visited the smoking area for a few minutes before leaving. Investigators were never able to determine exactly why he entered the cafe that day. Perhaps he expected Gia to be there, or hoped she would arrive. What is known is what happened next. After leaving, he walked to a nearby supermarket and purchased an additional knife. Then he headed toward Gia's residence. Security cameras recorded his arrival at approximately 5:35 p.m. Posing as a delivery worker, he managed to get past the building's security checkpoint. He then made his way to Gia's apartment and knocked on the door. Claiming that he had a package to deliver, he waited for someone to answer. And when the door finally began to open, eventually a woman answered from the other side of the door and told him to simply leave the package outside so she could pick it up later. Tae-hyun pretended to comply. He acted as though he was leaving the package at the entrance and walking away, but in reality, he quietly hid beside the doorway. Roughly 5 minutes later, the apartment door opened. That was the moment he had been waiting for. Kim Tae-hyun emerged from his hiding place, forced his way into the apartment, and attacked the person who had opened the door. However, to his surprise, the person he had attacked was not Gia. It was Gia's younger sister, a 22-year-old woman. Yet even after realizing he had targeted the wrong person, he showed no sign of remorse. Instead, he remained inside the apartment, staying silent so that neighbors would not become suspicious. Then at approximately 10:31 p.m., Tae-hyun heard someone approaching the apartment and unlocking the door. Believing that Gia had finally returned, he prepared himself. But once again, he was mistaken. The person entering the apartment was Gia's mother. The moment she stepped inside and realized something terrible had happened, Tae-hyun attacked her as well. Now he had already taken the lives of two innocent people. Yet he still wasn't satisfied. He continued waiting for the person he had originally come for. About an hour later, Gia finally returned home from an excursion she had attended earlier that day. As soon as she entered the apartment, she was confronted with a horrifying scene. Before she could react or call for help, Tae-hyun emerged and attacked her. At that point, the crime he had spent months planning was complete. But instead of fleeing the scene, he remained inside the apartment. Investigators later speculated that he may have realized there was no realistic chance of escaping capture. Or perhaps he had finally understood that the violence he had committed had done nothing to relieve the anger and frustration that had consumed him for so long. Whatever the reason, he stayed. Not for a few hours, not even for a single day. He remained there for 3 days. Meanwhile, Gia's friends began growing increasingly worried. Several days had passed without hearing from her, and repeated attempts to contact her by phone went unanswered. Concerned for her safety, they eventually contacted the police and asked officers to perform a welfare check at her residence. Even then, her friends hoped there was some innocent explanation. None of them could have imagined what authorities were about to discover. When officers entered the apartment, they found the 3 victims. To their shock, they also found Kim Tae-hyun still inside. During those 3 days, he had apparently been living in the apartment, consuming the food and alcohol he found there. Investigators also believed that he had attempted to harm himself during that period, but ultimately failed to follow through. He was arrested immediately at the scene. Because of injuries he had inflicted on himself, he was taken to a hospital before being transferred into police custody. News of the triple homicide spread rapidly throughout the community. Neighbors, friends, and relatives were devastated. Nobody could understand how something so horrific could have happened to 3 completely innocent women. At that point, the public still did not know the identity of the killer, who remained out of sight while recovering in the hospital. After being discharged about a week later, investigators formally questioned him and searched his residence for evidence. What they found painted a disturbing picture. Tae-hyun lived alone in a basement apartment that was reportedly filled with trash, leftover food, broken furniture, and signs of severe neglect. As details of the case became public, outrage exploded across South Korea. Large demonstrations were organized, with citizens demanding justice for the victims and calling on authorities to reveal the identity of the perpetrator. Many argued that someone responsible for such a carefully planned crime did not deserve anonymity or protection from public scrutiny. Thousands of signatures were collected. Eventually, authorities released Kim Tae-hyun's identity and photographs to the public. Police stated that the crime had been highly premeditated and that investigators possessed overwhelming evidence supporting that conclusion. At the same time, authorities continued protecting the identities of the victims and their surviving family members. For his part, Tae-hyun admitted to most of the charges against him. Investigators found no evidence that he suffered from a mental illness that would make him legally incapable of understanding his actions. Because of that, prosecutors sought the harshest punishment available, arguing that his actions demonstrated an extreme disregard for human life. Many of the victims' relatives publicly stated that Kim Tae-hyun deserved to die for what he had done, arguing that even a life sentence would be far too lenient for someone who had destroyed an entire family. Tae-hyun later made a public appearance in which he knelt down and apologized to the victim's relatives. He claimed that he felt tremendous guilt for still being alive and said that his heart ached because of what had happened. But few people were moved by those statements. After all, investigators believed there was strong reason to conclude that Tae-hyun had intended to carry out his plan until the very end. He had deliberately chosen the victim's home as the location of the crime despite knowing that Jia, the person he was obsessed with, would not even be there when he arrived. That meant he almost certainly expected to encounter other family members before he could reach his intended target. The impact of this case extended far beyond the courtroom. Public outrage sparked major discussions about South Korea's anti-stalking laws, leading to significant legal reforms. Under the previous system, stalking was often treated as a relatively minor offense, with penalties that many critics considered inadequate. In response to cases like this one, lawmakers pushed for harsher punishments, allowing convicted stalkers to face prison sentences of up to 5 years rather than the much lighter penalties that had previously existed. Finally, on October 12, 2021, the day of sentencing arrived. Although prosecutors had sought the death penalty, several factors worked against that outcome. South Korea had not carried out an execution in decades, the defendant had admitted to much of what he had done, and his previous criminal record did not include serious acts of physical violence. As a result, the court sentenced Kim Tae-hyun to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And with that, one of South Korea's most shocking stalking cases came to an end. But the tragedy left behind a lasting lesson, one that many people felt should never be forgotten. For months, warning signs had appeared one after another: harassment, repeated stalking, prior complaints, and increasingly alarming behavior all pointed toward a dangerous escalation. Yet none of it was enough to stop the disaster before it happened. This case serves as a reminder that obsession can become extraordinarily dangerous when it is ignored, dismissed, or allowed to grow unchecked. Because sometimes the greatest threat isn't a criminal mastermind or a hardened career offender. Sometimes it's a person who becomes consumed by resentment, isolation, and the belief that they have nothing left to lose. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like it and share it with a friend. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I upload new videos every Tuesday. Welcome to the swamp.